Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hi everyone. For many of us, it is that time of year when the sun shines hot and the wind blows cold, when it is summer in the light and winter in the shade. And during this season's turning, I was thrilled to talk to Dr. Emily Bell about Dickens's second novel, Oliver Twist, or The Parish Boy's Progress. Emily is a lecturer in digital humanities and digital skills at the University of Leeds, and is an alumna of both the University of Warwick, where she read English, and York, where she completed her MA and PhD. She is also editor of The Dickensian, and is a researcher and consultant on programmes such as the BBC's Horrible Histories and Homeschool History. In this episode, I'm reading excerpts from not only Oliver Twist, but you will also hear clips from a performance of Sikes and Nancy, which I filmed during lockdown at the Charles Dickens Museum. In short, inside the very building where Dickens actually wrote this astonishing book. Our conversation also touches on some of the more disturbing themes in the novel, such as Nancy's murder, Sikes' hanging, and antisemitism. So just be aware if that's something you might find difficult to listen to. I hope you enjoy the episode. Emily, hello. Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's lovely to have you here. It's really great. And we're looking at Oliver Twist, which is a book that I was sort of slightly avoiding because I thought it was too obvious. And I thought I knew it. And I thought, well, I don't need to really, I'll leave that a bit further along. But actually, there's so much more than I gave it credit in there. It's really something. What are your first impressions looking at it again?
I always introduce it to students, and I always feel bad about introducing it to people as a glorious mess of a novel, because there's so much going on and there's so many different genres at play. And the characters that seem to be the focal characters, so Oliver himself is one of the more boring characters to me in the text. But there's so many other interesting things happening with the characters that are kind of peripheral and move to the center. And we have the heavy satire and the melodrama. So there's a lot going on. And you can see Dickens playing with style and playing with the serial form. But as you say, people feel like they know the novel, often from adaptations, that kind of smooth out some of the problems of the text, I think, or some of the things that readers find more difficult. So that's really interesting to me, the way that we come at it through adaptations that generally miss out, for example, the whole evil half-brother subplot, and don't really engage with that part in adaptations. So it's got a really interesting kind of history of reception, and revisiting it is always, it feels very different to what you expect because of all those cultural associations we have with it.
I think that's completely right. And I think for often in people's minds, they're thinking, do you like Oliver Twist? They're thinking, how much do I like the songs that Lionel Bart wrote? That's kind of foremost in their minds. And you saying about Oliver potentially being one of the most boring characters in the book, a bit like possibly Little Nell gets that same problem, doesn't she, with the old curiosity shop? But what I was amazed to see, and the adaptations missed this, is that Oliver actually is quite capable of losing his shit, isn't he? I mean, he's quite capable of getting filled with righteous anger. So the moment where he beats up Noah Claypole to defend his mother is really powerful and sort of stirring, and you really cheer for him. So it's almost like he there are other aspects there. There are other aspects there that I didn't know were there. But having said that, he does kind of seem to me get written out of his own story quite a lot. That things move on without him.
They do.
Don't they?
And we start off with this kind of story that feels like it's going to be the life journey, a kind of Bildungsroman, developing Oliver's character over his childhood, over his life. And that's not really the direction that we end up going in. I think at the beginning of the novel, we've got more of a sense of his personality, the kind of famous "Please, sir, I want some more," and a moment where Dickens says that he was at risk of falling into brutality and kind of stupidness by lack of food, by his treatment. And as you say, that moment where he really does stand up for himself. And then we sort of lose a sense of that a little bit as we pan to the other characters and we meet this very vibrant cast of criminal characters in London who take centre stage more and more. Lord Melbourne complained that he didn't want to read about pickpockets and coffin makers, but Queen Victoria found it very interesting. I think for me, the thing I really recommend about it is that it shows Dickens working out his art. And his friend and biographer, John Forster, talks about this as the moment that he gets his higher purpose in social reform, where, Pickwick Papers is a series of fun sketches. And at this point, we're starting to move into tackling really specific issues of the time. And it's the first novel that he ends up attaching his name to. So with the first printing, he sends it back to have Charles Dickens on it rather than Boz. So that moment when Charles Dickens really becomes Charles Dickens, everyone's expecting him to fail. They think that he can't do a follow-up as good as Pickwick. There's a wonderful quote of someone saying something like, he goes up like a firecracker and he's going to come down like the stick. They don't think that the second album, as it were, is going to go well. And it's quite different. And it shows Dickens playing with the serial form, the kind of almost cliffhangers at the end of the chapters that would be the installments from Bentley's Miscellany. And it shows, as I said at the beginning, that mess of different styles that draws on, for example, the influences that Dickens has from his childhood, the people that he loved to read, such as Smollett, such as Fielding, such as Jonathan Swift, who wrote Gulliver's Travels. That really satirical 18th century style is how the novel starts. And I always kind of read it out when I'm talking about the novel because it's unsustainable. It's very funny. That really high satirical style that it begins with sort of goes away. And then we have this more melodramatic influence. And he addresses us and tells us about his style in chapter 17 in a very famous passage as well. Dickens speaks to us and he tells us what he's trying to do. And he's explaining to us why we have these comic scenes and we have this very melodramatic tone in other scenes.
It is the custom on the stage, in all good murderous melodramas, to present the tragic and the comic scenes in as regular alternation as the layers of red and white in a side of streaky bacon. The hero sinks upon his straw bed, weighed down by fetters and misfortunes. In the next scene, his faithful but unconscious squire regales the audience with a comic song. We behold, with throbbing bosoms, the heroine in the grasp of a proud and ruthless baron, her virtue and her life alike in danger, drawing forth her dagger to preserve the one at the cost of the other. And just as our expectations are wrought up to the highest pitch, a whistle is heard, and we are straightway transported to the great hall of the castle, where a grey-headed seneschal sings a funny chorus with a funnier body of vassals who are free of all sorts of places, from church vaults to palaces, and roam about in company carolling perpetually. Such changes appear absurd, but they are not so unnatural as they would seem at first sight.
So part of what he's getting at in this passage then is that in real life, comedy comes on the heels of tragedy. This is something that we deal with and we understand in life, but that in fiction might feel ridiculous.
It's a fantastic statement of intent almost, isn't it, that chapter 17?
Absolutely. And the paragraph after that goes on to think about skill and craft and think about the craft of the author. And it's him kind of being very self-aware of what it is to create popular entertainment as well. So to draw on popular entertainment and use it to convey those messages.
But do you feel there's anything self-conscious in the way that he's writing there? Compare this to something like Bleak House, where he just lets rip, he just doesn't care. He just goes, I know what I'm about, this is what I am. I am an author. I am a great author. But there's something in the way that he's sort of setting out his stall and explaining to his audience, by the way, this is what I'm trying to do.
I think you're absolutely right that he is thinking self-consciously about what it means to be an author. And again, that weight of expectation on him for that second novel, while he was still finishing Pickwick. So that's not even finished when he starts. And he ends up starting Nicholas Nickleby before he's finished this one. So part of, for him, what it means to be an author is to write a lot and try and make enough money to make this his profession. And another part of it then is how he situates himself, how he finds his voice amongst his heroes and amongst popular entertainment of the time. And I think that's what's really interesting about this kind of statement of artistic and creative intent.
So picking up Oliver Twist, I feel like the first thing that's helpful to the reader is an understanding of what these poor laws were.
Yeah, absolutely. So the workhouses had existed for quite a long time, certainly since the 18 teens. The kind of workhouse that Oliver goes to is in existence in a similar kind of way. But there's a really distinct change to the law in 1834, which is the Poor Law Amendment Act. And what that does is changes the way that support can be provided within communities. So many towns had workhouses, which were there when people really had nothing else and nowhere else to go. But a lot of towns were able to kind of choose to provide what we call out relief to people. So if you were an agricultural labourer whose work was seasonal, kind of did harvest work and so on, you'd be out of work for a while, they could provide money to you in your own home to keep you going until work could come through. The Poor Law Amendment Act centralised the way that the workhouses were managed and removed the ability to make those kinds of decisions, while also insisting on making workhouses as unpleasant as possible a place to be. So the idea was to represent a place of horror that you would not want to go to. You would do anything you could to avoid going there. But if you went in, men and women would be separated, children would be separated and sort of prepared for certain kinds of work. You would have to pay for your upkeep, and families were separated. And it was just horrific. The idea of not providing meat, Bumble says, don't feed them meat. This was a deliberate project to make this a horrific place to be and to make the conditions something you would do anything to avoid. So that's why we start the novel with this very pointed satire, in the sense that here is an innocent child that's being put through the system. So even if somebody's on board with adults being forced into this position if they have no money, here is a true innocent going through the system and highlighting the horrors of it for us. So that's very much the purpose of what Dickens is doing in those opening chapters of Oliver Twist, and in what he's doing with the workhouse narrative of Mr. Bumble, who ends up in his own workhouse. It's a kind of righteous justice for someone who is perpetuating this system on other people and truly believes that the poor deserve this kind of treatment. So yeah, this is a really important context for the novel, and Dickens is doing really interesting stuff with how he satirizes it and how he presents it, in terms of the hunger of it, in terms of the kind of narrowing of people's minds, both those who run it and those who live in it, that Oliver might become brutalized and might become stupid just because of the horrible conditions that he is subject to.
That's so interesting, isn't it? You know, that idea of the brutalization of the children makes them appear stupid, and they're misread by the board that they have to stand in front of so often, aren't they? It reminds me also of Bumble always saying that they're ungrateful as well. They're difficult, they're ungrateful because they're half-starved and malnourished. But there's that awful, sort of very dark section where Oliver nearly becomes a chimney sweep, I think. They're talking in detail about, how to get a boy out of a chimney if he's stuck. Well, light the fire, light it really hot so his feet burn, so he wriggles himself free. It's a fantastic satire, but it's weighted down with very, very harsh truth, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And children died. Children chimney sweeps died. And George Cruikshank, the illustrator for the novel, he did later claim that he came up with the whole idea for the novel. So we have to take what he says with a pinch of salt. But one of the things that he says is that he drew Dickens's attention to an article published in the Times about baby farms, which Oliver ends up in. So Mrs. Mann's is a baby farm where people would take on children for money, these kind of orphan children, and so many of them would die due to mistreatment, malnourishment, and so on. So underlying this satire is the real horror of so many children being absolutely thrown away because the idea of support for the poor is the bare minimum, and that's it.
The night was bitter cold. The snow lay on the ground, frozen into a hard, thick crust, so that only the heaps that had drifted into byways and corners were affected by the sharp wind that howled abroad, which, as if expending increased fury on such prey as it found, caught it savagely up in clouds and, whirling it into 1,000 misty eddies, scattered it in air. Bleak, dark, and piercing cold. It was a night for the well-housed and fed to draw round the bright fire, and thank God they were at home, and for the homeless, starving wretch to lay him down and die. Many hunger-worn outcasts close their eyes in our bare streets at such times, who, let their crimes have been what they may, can hardly open them in a more bitter world. How do you feel that Dickens feels towards these criminals that he I don't include Nancy as one of them, but, Sikes, Richard Dawkins, the Artful Dodger, and Fagin. Do you feel like Dickens himself has sympathy, perhaps, for Fagin at the end?
I definitely think that Dickens does have sympathy for Fagin at the end. And I think it gives so many of the problems of the style of the novel. Because if we see Fagin as many people have done, a kind of satanic representation, where the first time we see him, he's standing over a fire holding a pitchfork, essentially. And these connotations that were present in the cultural consciousness to do with Jewishness, and representations in melodrama on the stage of being inherently and irredeemably a villain, that Dickens's descriptions of him, which are highly problematic, and people draw attention to this during his lifetime, that he represents Jewishness in a way that is stereotypical and focuses on just the worst aspects of those stereotypes. So in Fagin, we have this problem of Dickens creating a character that is both a type, a melodramatic type, satanic, the kind of seducer of children, and all of that kind of bag of associations that he gives to Fagin. But he's also the first father figure that Oliver has in the novel. And when he enters into Fagin's home, he's given food, and we've had Bumble say, "Don't feed children meat." And the first thing that Oliver sees is Fagin cooking sausages. And he gets given meat, and he gets given alcohol, and he gets put to sleep quite quickly. But the first scene we see is very domestic, it's very warm. The children have an affection for Fagin. He is like a father figure. And I don't think we want to see Oliver's first father figure, no matter how problematic that relationship turns out, punished in the way that he does get punished. But that satanic figure that he represents has to be.
It's interesting you say that, because I remember a moment in the book where Oliver's in this strange situation, but Fagin is play acting, isn't he, with the boys and doing pickpocket training. And Oliver's laughing until the tears run down his face at Fagin's performance. That's a really interesting cognitive dissonance, really. His captor and also his protector at the same time. It's really, I suppose I would feel sorry for Fagin in a way, but there's moments where he mentioned that he is responsible for many other deaths. People that have crossed his path have ended up hanging. So it's a tricky one, isn't it? I'd be interested to know about Sikes, though, because Sikes is just a monster, really, isn't he? But something I noticed reading it was that before he's told the essential lie by Bolter and Fagin about what Nancy's been up to, Sikes says something like, "Out with it, look sharp, or Nance will think I'm lost." As in, Sikes is taking a moment there, and it's the only moment I can find where he's thinking about somebody else at home worrying about him coming home late. Do you see what I mean? Because Nancy sees something in Sikes that nobody else, I don't even know if Dickens does, that nobody else gets to see, that there's a chance of even reforming him. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's really interesting. For me, Dickens says in the preface that he writes a bit later that Nancy's loyalty to Sikes is part of her character as well. You can see with Nancy, she's torn between these different kinds of loyalty. So for me, that seems more about creating that connection for her. Because as you say, he does come across as fairly irredeemable. And I've had a lot of conversations with students about why the dog has to die as well, and the relationship between Sikes and Bullseye as something that's really interesting. And another horrific death in the novel is the moment where Bullseye dashes out his brains trying to reunite with his master. I think there is a sense that the loyalty of the dog and the loyalty of Nancy should try and reflect something good about the character. There must be something there. Otherwise, why would these characters be loyal? Why would these figures around Sikes be loyal to him? But I don't think anybody is sad about his death. Everyone's sad about the dog when it comes to that moment, rather than about Sikes himself.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, Bullseye, the dog, he's quite threatening towards the children, isn't he? He's not necessarily a dog that you warm to initially, but when Sikes takes that decision when he's fleeing to drown Bullseye, and I think it's one of the most fantastic passages that Dickens writes there, about the dog having a sense of how can the dog understand what Sikes is planning to do, but the dog has a sense that Sikes is calling him to kill him, and he runs off. He's very good with animals, isn't he, Dickens?
Oh yeah, animals are very revealing. Yeah, animals are very revealing in Dickens. And I think that the conversations I've had about why the dog has to die and seeing him as an extension of Sikes, and in that moment of drowning the dog and the dog running away and that kind of pursuit, it is then the dog that pursues him. If we see that dog that sometimes Sikes growls at people and the dog growls at people. There's quite a lot of parallels in their behavior. That just before Sikes dies, he is essentially pursued by an element of himself. So not only does he see the eyes of Nancy, but the dog is a part of himself that he tried to drown, he tried to get rid of, and comes back to lead the mob to him. And I think that's the only way to rationalize the rather sad dog death. But that idea that the animals reveal something interesting about the people, and obviously you've got Jip in David Copperfield, the kind of petted lap dog, and she can't really come to terms with the idea of him getting old and dying, and how that reveals something about her. Sikes and his dog is a really interesting relationship that adaptations do keep. You do tend to see Sikes and his dog in filmic adaptations. So it's interesting that we think that does reveal something, that does tell us something about his character.
Yeah. And there's something else interesting in that moment where he's fleeing. This really struck me looking at Sikes and Nancy and performing that. When Sikes is running away, he really sees Nancy's ghost, doesn't he? Because I used to sort of half read that thinking, oh, well, she's not really there. But as far as Sikes is concerned, she really is there, and he really sees her eyes, and he sees her standing, watching him. And there's that terrifying moment where he tries to turn around and walk the other direction, but she's flipped around behind him. He went on, doggedly. But as he left the town behind him and plunged into the solitude and darkness of the road, he felt a dread and awe creeping upon him which shook him to the core. Every object before him, substance or shadow, still or moving, took the semblance of some fearful thing. But these fears were nothing compared to the sense that haunted him of that morning's ghastly figure following at his heels. He could trace its shadow in the gloom, supply the smallest item of the outline, and note how stiff and solemn it seemed to stalk along. He could hear its garments rustling in the leaves, and every breath of wind came laden with that last low cry. If he stopped, it did the same. If he ran, it followed. Not running too, that would have been a relief, but like a corpse endowed with the mere machinery of life and borne on one slow melancholy wind that never rose or fell. At times he turned, with desperate determination, resolved to beat this phantom off though it should look him dead. But the hair rose on his head, and his blood stood still, for it had turned with him, and was behind him then. Were we in some other kind of realm at this point with her appearance as a spectre?
It's a good question. I think certainly you could get ghosts in melodrama, but it starts to get us into the Gothic, doesn't it? In the same way that in Great Expectations, when we see that kind of vision he has of Miss Havisham hanging from the beam, suddenly takes us into a moment of something supernatural, but also kind of just absorbed into the narrative as if it's normal, as if that kind of supernatural can exist. So here, yeah, it's definitely Dickens working up the pathos and really hammering home how unforgivable this crime is, which again just reinforces how important Nancy's development is to the novel and the kind of loss that we suffer in losing her.
I'm going to wind right back, Emily. What got you into Dickens in the first place?
Well, so I don't know if you'll want to include it in the podcast, but I'm going to tell you the story of how I did get into Dickens specifically.
I'm absolutely going to include this in the episode.
So the way that I got into Dickens as a specific writer was that I'd had an interest in Victorian fiction. I was very much interested in that period and the kinds of outputs that were coming out of that period, and probably broader 19th century, really. And as I started trying to develop ideas for what I wanted to research, I did a wonderful, enormous mind map of all the different ideas that I had, many of which revolved around the idea of truth and the idea of authenticity in fiction and how we get to that. And I was essentially trying to work out who to write about, what to focus on. I did this enormous mind map, and I found that under every idea that I had, there was an example from Dickens. And at that point, I thought everything that has ever possible to say about Dickens must have been said. There cannot be anything left to say about Dickens. But I looked at the ideas I had, and I looked at how Dickens spoke to every single one of them and thought, oh God, I'm going to have to do Dickens. Because there's so much that's rich there and so much that's interesting to do with it's not the high realism of George Eliot. It's this combination of styles. It draws on the Gothic, it draws on sensation writing. You know, he tries out kind of Wilkie Collins style in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and he tries the more sensational style of A Tale of Two Cities. but he falls back into certain patterns that are distinctly Dickensian. And that includes the humor and that includes the characterization. And there's so much there that's so rich that we could probably keep working on Dickens forever. And that's what I realized, is that there's so much to say. And that's not even to speak about my particular pet projects, which are things like his short stories, which are criminally overlooked and very rarely discussed in scholarship. So just, a tip there if you want to do podcasts on things like George Silverman's explanation or holiday romance. I'm all over that, because these areas are so neglected in Dickens. But even the novels, even those wonderful novels, there's so much to say about them, and there's so many new angles that haven't been tried, that he's just unbelievably rich. And I think starting out from that attitude of everything has been said, it's quite a natural place to start. But when you look into it, you can't resist trying to find that little niche, that new idea, that new way in, because it's such fun.
Yeah, I think the fact that he's so funny as well as deeply powerful and moving and really good for actors, which leads me actually to Sikes and Nancy. So towards the end of his life, then he adapts the murder section for as part of his reading tours.
Yes, he decides he wants to do the murder of Nancy. And people are not quite sure that this is a good idea. A lot of his readings were A Christmas Carol or things like that, things that were often to raise money. He started out doing readings to raise money before he did his reading tours. Feel-good moments from his novels or potted versions of his stories. So this really dramatic, kind of horrific moment in the novel, as you say, that has such an enormous impact, was a real thing to perform. And there's a wonderful image, a kind of engraving of him reading in 1870 at St. James Hall. I think it would have been his last reading. And it kind of presents him leaning over with this kind of twisted face, and the audience look a little bit sort of shocked by it, I think. And it seems to me that's a real representation of what he was doing with Sikes and Nancy, of conveying the horror of it and pushing himself beyond his limits, to the point where he had to have a doctor waiting off stage who would take his pulse and check, and it was always very high, and sometimes he would have to lie down for quite a long time to recover from it. He came off once and said to his reading tour manager, "I shall tear myself to pieces." And that's what he was doing with Sikes and Nancy. It was really tearing himself to pieces. But you, as someone who's performed it, what's your feeling? Did you use Dickens's prompt script?
I did, yes. Well, I used his prompt script, and then I included actually some other parts from Oliver Twist. For example, when Nancy comes up onto the bridge and those descriptions of the shipping, which I think he cuts actually from his prompt copy, but I put that back in. It was a very dark night. A mist hung over the river, deepening the red glare of the fires that burnt upon the small craft moored off the different wharfs, and rendering darker and more indistinct the murky buildings on the banks, which frowned sternly upon water too black to reflect even their lumbering shapes. The forest of shipping below bridge and the thickly scattered spires of churches above were nearly all hidden from sight. Nancy had taken a few restless turns to and fro, closely watched by her hidden observer, when the heavy bell of St. Paul's tolled for the death of another day. Very interesting, though, isn't it? Looking at prompt copies and seeing how he's quite capable of ripping up pages of his own books and not having a problem, and rewriting, scribbling and rewrites and all sorts. But with him performing it, it's just so interesting. What do you think's driving him? Because he must have a sense then that the greatness of this novel is perhaps Sikes and Nancy. Really, the power. I mean, does he have some sort of death wish that he's pushing himself to this limit? I mean, what's it for?
It's a good question, and I think partly he wanted the challenge of it. Again, that actor side of himself, where he had done amateur theatricals, performed in front of the Queen once, and liked acting, and had that moment in the beginning of his life where he had the big audition and had a cold and missed that opportunity. But why this particular passage? There are plenty of moments of pathos and kind of deaths in various novels that he might have done. And it's a good question. And I do find the prompt copy so telling in terms of what he's doing. So there's a note that says murder coming. You can see that that's him kind of trying to ramp up the tension, or the note that says terror until the end. that he's really leaning on the terror, on the pathos, and on the horror of it in a way that I don't think he could do with passages from other novels to the same extent.
Yeah. It's very interesting because I looked at his stage directions as well for when I was performing it. And as an actor, you approach it. It's, it's been 150 odd years. You don't follow to the letter everything he says. You think, well, no, I'm gonna find my way, and if it feels right to do that, I will. But the line that he underlines, and struck her down very, very heavily. And I remember looking at that, thinking, well, I might not shout that. Actually, I might, something else might happen. Of course, when I came to film it, I completely bellowed and struck her down.
You were what tonight, you she-devil? Every word you said was heard. Then, if every word I said was heard, I spared you, Bill. Bill, you haven't got the heart to kill me. Oh, think of all I've given up, this one night accepted, for you. Bill, for dear God's sake, for your own, for mine, stop before you spill my blood. I have been true to you upon my guilty soul, I have. The housebreaker freed one arm and grasped his pistol. The certainty of immediate detection if he fired flashed across his mind, and so he beat it twice upon the upturned face that almost touched his own. She staggered and fell, nearly blinded by a deep gash in her forehead, but raising herself with difficulty on her knees, drew from her bosom a white handkerchief, and holding it up as high towards heaven as her feeble strength would allow, breathed one prayer to her Maker. It was a ghastly figure to look upon. The murderer, staggering backward to the wall and shutting out the sight with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down. The bright sun burst upon the crowded city in clear and radiant glory. Through costly coloured glass and paper-mended window, through cathedral dome and rotten crevice, it shed its equal ray. It lighted up the room where the murdered woman lay. He tried to shut it out, but it would stream in. If the sight had been a ghastly one in the dull morning, what was it now in all that brilliant light? He had not moved. He had been afraid to stir. There's something so powerful and potent about it that I can understand that he would have been addicted perhaps to perform it as well. I can really see that. But something I cut, actually, which you mentioned as very powerful earlier, is the death of Bullseye. Because oddly,
Right.
I didn't have the confidence that it wouldn't be unintentionally funny right at the end. So you've got Sikes, looping, trying to escape, and he hangs himself by mistake, and then the dog jumps after him and dashes his brains out. But oddly, I wanted it to end on Sikes hanging. And, it's so potent, isn't it? It's so pertinent, that violence and the murder of a woman by a man, the statistic, I think, in the UK, what is it? Is it one woman in every 3 days, I think, is murdered by a man, and certain things were happening in the news that while we were filming it. And so I sort of doubted what it was for. But now, even the detail of Nancy coming up onto the bridge and looking over her shoulder and letting someone who's walking behind her pass her, that could be written this week. That experience. How do you feel about it? Because it's not easy to read, is it, that whole section, I don't think?
No, I don't think it is. And I think it speaks to what Dickens was trying to do with Nancy and what he's trying to do with creating sympathy and creating a character that you can have sympathy for. And I think doing that reading of that passage, it doesn't allow anybody watching it to refuse to sympathize with Nancy, to refuse to see the pathos of it, and refuse to humanize her, in spite of the fact that she's a prostitute, in spite of the fact that she's one of the criminal classes. Choosing that particular passage confronts the audience with the horror of it and doesn't really allow you to get around it. Whereas I think if you read it, if someone kind of skips over it and gets onto the chapters that then deal with the kind of legal or not quite legal justice that the other characters face, Nancy's ending can sort of be read in the context of, all the criminal characters come to fitting ends. But by just presenting that scene by itself and confronting a live audience with it, I think Dickens was making it that you could not reject her humanity. You could not reject the pathos and the sympathy of that scene. So the passage from the introduction then, he says, "It has been observed of this girl that her devotion to the brutal housebreaker does not seem natural, and it has been objected to Sikes in the same breath, with some inconsistency, as I venture to think, that he is surely overdrawn, because in him there would appear to be none of those redeeming traits which are objected to as unnatural in his mistress. Of the latter objection, I will merely say that I fear there are in the world some insensible and callous natures that do become at last utterly and irredeemably bad. But whether this be so or not, of one thing I am certain, that there are such men as Sikes who, being closely followed through the same space of time and through the same current of circumstances, would not give, by one look or action of a moment, the faintest indication of a better nature. Whether every gentler human feeling is dead within such bosoms, or the proper chord to strike has rusted and is hard to find, I do not know, but the fact is so, I am sure. It is useless to discuss whether the conduct and character of the girl seems natural or unnatural, probable or improbable, right or wrong. It is true. And that sentence is in capitals. Every man who has watched these melancholy shades of life knows it to be so. Suggested to my mind long ago, long before I dealt in fiction, but what I often saw and read of in actual life around me, I have for years tracked it through many profligate and noisome ways and found it still the same. From the first introduction of that poor wretch to her laying her bloody head upon the robber's breast, there is not one word exaggerated or overwrought. It is emphatically God's truth, for it is the truth. He leaves in such depraved and miserable breasts the hope yet lingering behind, the last fair drop of water at the bottom of the dried-up, weed-choked well. It involves the best and worst shades of our common nature, much of its ugliest hues and something of its most beautiful. It's a contradiction, an anomaly, an apparent impossibility, but it is the truth. I am glad to have had it doubted, for in that circumstance I find a sufficient assurance that it needed to be told. So to me, that sense there of, he calls her the poor wretch, and he says every part of her journey is true, and this is God's truth, and there is sympathy in it. By confronting the reading public with just that moment that most has to gain our sympathy, as I said, I really think he's forcing us to feel that. And the horror of it. So even if we don't think about the morality of the rest of her character and what she does, in that moment, he's saying there is no other reaction. You have to feel sympathy. You have to feel the horror of this.
That's amazing, Emily, isn't it? To hear it from his own mouth is so powerful. And that section, the hope that he talks about at the end. And of course, in the scene, the light comes through, doesn't it? The light comes through the window, and there's the line about it. The sun sheds its rays equally on everything, good and bad. And that's what, I suppose that's the light of truth. And I suppose Nancy's ascent to heaven, perhaps. It's a very, very powerful moment, I think.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think that sense that she is, raising her hands to heaven in that appeal, both to the reader, both to Sikes, and also a kind of religious appeal. And she does mention heaven. The passage mentions heaven. Spare my life for the love of heaven. Folded hands as high towards heaven. I think Dickens is kind of challenging his reader to say that she wouldn't. To try and see that kind of immorality that they would associate with prostitution, and to say, does this woman not deserve mercy, both at the hands of Sikes and at the hands of the reader, and also in a religious sense? Because the Victorian novel has such a problem with what to do with fallen women or prostitutes, and they so often end up dead, or at the very best transported somewhere else, to another country, to no longer be a problem. So how to resolve that and how to rehabilitate her is something that Dickens is clearly concerned with. And I think you can also see in his life, in the establishing of Urania Cottage with Angela Burdett Coutts in the 1840s, where he sets up this home essentially for homeless women. It's often referred to as a house for fallen women, obviously essentially being for prostitutes, but it was meant to help women who'd fallen on hard times, whether through prostitution or other reasons, to learn skills of keeping house, essentially, and then to find them a way to continue their life. And his commitment to that in his life of finding a life for people beyond sins that society would deem completely unforgivable, I think really speaks powerfully to what he's trying to do with Nancy here, saying we've got to both give her another life that the readings do. The readings give her life, the novel immortalizes her, but we've got to show mercy, not just as readers, but in a religious sense, to people that commit this kind of unforgivable crime.
It makes me think that one of the sad things about Nancy's death, of course, is that she could have escaped. Brownlow and Rose on Waterloo Bridge, they give her the chance that very night to just be spirited away in a carriage, go abroad. Nancy doesn't believe that she deserves to be saved, I feel like. And her last words are all about Bill, aren't they? While he's killing her, she's saying, for your sake, Bill, don't do this. Think about what will happen to you if you do this. She has such a sort of nobleness of spirit and character as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that loyalty, where she will not give him up. She will not do what he thinks that she has done, essentially. And that tragedy of it all coming too late. So at the end, she says, we must have time, a little time. The whole point of the conversations about saving her is that she feels like it's come too late. And again, that sense in Victorian fiction that once a woman has transgressed in this way, it is always going to be too late. And that repetition of the idea of time, and that at the very end, the last words that she says, it's never too late to repent. They told me so, I feel it now, but we must have time, a little time. She's not given that time. But the reader, the kind of Victorian lawmaker, kind of Victorian voice of morality, does have time to try and think about how to address this issue, and not allow people to be thrown away forever. And I think that's also partly why, speaking as we were earlier of slightly more minor characters, that we see Charlie Bates, who is not quite as fun as the Dodger, but he's there, try and reform, essentially. And this idea that are these children, we don't know how old Nancy is, but obviously Dodger is older than Oliver, but still a child. At what point do we decide people are irredeemable and are criminals forever? Is there a chance of repentance, or even, I wouldn't say repentance, because these are children that have been forced into a particular kind of life, but a way for them to escape from that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you've answered the question why this scene in the book, and why Dickens takes it on, and why it's so extraordinary and powerful. I mean, it's as powerful, I think, I don't know if you think this, but I feel like it's as powerful as anything he wrote afterwards. Any of his later novels, however great they are, the whole Sikes and Nancy section is just astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It does have an enduring power. It's a wonderful moment.
I'm always very interested in the tiny, forgettable characters that get cut in adaptations because you can't justify putting them in. Are there any ones that stand out for you in this book?
Well, I think one of the ways of getting into Dickens's representation of Fagin and thinking about what he's doing with Jewishness and the kind of anti-Semitism of the novel is thinking about a really minor character that pops up, whose name is Barney. Barney is just another Jewish character, another criminal Jewish character. And we have this scene between Barney, Sikes, Fagin, and Nancy. And it's interesting because there's more stereotypes here as well. So Dickens still describes Barney in similar terms to Fagin. Quite often he calls Fagin repulsive. He applies the same thing to Barney. But Barney notably has a lisp, which is another stereotype of Jewish characters, particularly on the stage, that happens in this period. So people being critical of Dickens's representation of Jewishness and Jewish identity, it's not even that we can just say Fagin is meant to represent a kind of satanic seducer, and therefore that doesn't quite justify but explains what's happening. There's another opportunity that Dickens has here, and he still makes some of the same mistakes. So I think Barney is a character of essentially one chapter. I'm not sure if he comes up again, in fact. Is really interesting in thinking about what Dickens is succeeding with, and what's problematic here in how he's dealing with Fagin.
Yeah. On the anti-Semitism, I imagine a lot of casual readers of that period would not have necessarily thought that it was anti-Semitic.
Yeah, it's fairly typical of the time, which is not to say that there was not better representation. In some of Thackeray's novels, there's kind of better, more authentic Jewish representation. But he was definitely called up on it during his lifetime. In 1854, the Jewish Chronicle asked why Jews alone should be excluded from the sympathizing heart of this great author and powerful friend of the oppressed. And he essentially tried to defend himself and said he'd made Fagin Jewish because, in his words, it unfortunately was true of the time to which the story refers that class of criminal almost invariably was a Jew.
The mud lay thick upon the stones, and a black mist hung over the streets. The rain fell sluggishly down, and everything felt cold and clammy to the touch. It seemed just the night when it befitted such a being as the Jew to be abroad. As he glided stealthily along, creeping beneath the shelter of the walls and doorways, the hideous old man seemed like some loathsome reptile, engendered in the slime and darkness through which he moved, crawling forth by night in search of some rich offal for a meal.
So he did claim that he had no bad feelings about the Jewish faith. He had he wasn't trying to say anything about that. But a little bit later, Eliza Davis writes to him, and she is a Jewish woman, protesting against his portrayal of Fagin, and says that he is encouraging prejudice against Jewish people. And so then when Dickens is doing a later edition of Oliver Twist, he does change the text a little bit. So he essentially changes references to Fagin as the Jew, which encourages us to see him as this kind of melodramatic stage type representing all of those negative connotations, and starts to call him Fagin more often, use his name and get away from the sense that he is meant to represent the entirety of that identity. And that happens in his Last Night Alive. That chapter was the Jew's Last Night Alive, and it becomes Fagin's Last Night Alive. So he does acknowledge this, and he does try and make up for it in Our Mutual Friend, representing Mr. Ryer as a kind of more authentic and more sympathetic idea of Jewishness. But it is problematic, and it's something that he doesn't quite see the problem with for a few decades. It takes a few decades for him to realise that perhaps he could have done better. But he does change, and the second part of the novel contains far fewer references to just the Jew and actually uses Fagin's name.
It's out there at the moment, isn't it, that I think of, David Baddiel, for instance, writing his book, Jews Don't Count, the idea that it's not seen, anti-Semitism isn't necessarily seen in the way that other prejudices are. That's very interesting. But it's so interesting because having now read The Old Curiosity Shop, where it's very often the child, the dwarf, the robber, the burglar, the murderer, he does that a lot. So I can see that he could sort of walk into that as a writer without giving it enough thought, potentially. I don't know. And the idea is so interesting, isn't it? The idea that he rewrites his manuscript then, and just thinking of Roald Dahl at the moment, that story out there.
Yeah, and it's nice that Dickens was the one that made the change. I think that makes a big difference. But I read recently a very interesting interpretation that suggests that one of the reasons that Dickens gives Fagin the kind of ending that he does is because Bob Fagin, the name Fagin, was drawn from life. It was drawn from a child that worked in the blacking factory with Dickens and tried to kind of habituate him to his new way of life. And this article was suggesting that Dickens wanted to kill that part of his life, essentially. So by giving a character this name and giving them that kind of tortured ending, it was a way of making Bob Fagin, dead in terms of Dickens's literary career, which I thought was a really interesting idea, that because he's got this idea of Jewishness, but he's also giving the character a name of somebody that he actually knew, and why you would bring those things together and why it turns out the way that it does is quite interesting in terms of Dickens's life, Dickens's biography, and his kind of repression of the blacking factory moment in his life, but the way that it surfaces in his works anyway.
Something you've mentioned a couple of times is that Dickens was also writing Nicholas Nickleby and the Pickwick Papers. They were all overlapping at this time. There is something in this book, a story within the story, which is so delightful and so fun, and has probably one of my favourite ever Dickens character names, and that is Conky Chickweed. I absolutely love where that drops into the story, where it's actually very serious for Oliver, isn't it? And then this elaborate, that's a very Pickwickian moment, isn't it? Where a character comes in and tells this really long story.
Yeah, Dickens does love a story within a story, and he does love names like that, what we call cretylic names, which are names that reveal something about the character. Though I don't know what Conky Chickweed is meant to reveal around that character, really. It just talks about cockfighting in part of that story as well, so maybe that's where we're getting the kind of chickweed thing from. But yeah, I think Dickens can't help himself, and that's part of how he populates his fictional worlds with such interesting characters. And it's often not the narrator or the kind of main character of the novel that is the most interesting and most vibrant, or even the character that we can visualize most clearly. If you try to visualize Oliver Twist, you probably see somebody from an adaptation, essentially, kind of small child, blonde hair. But if you try and visualize Nancy, Fagin, or even the Artful Dodger, who's got that wonderful kind of contradiction of adult clothes and being a child, being something like 4'9", we're told, in his bloomers, they're so vivid. And characters like this and this kind of incident of Conky Chickweed, you get a kind of vivid sense of a character that doesn't really matter to the story. And Dickens is so much better at making those characters live for that moment than he is at making Oliver kind of very obviously memorable to us. And I would say that's true even with Pip and David Copperfield. What do they look like? We don't have those props. We associate Sikes with bullseye, as we've talked about. We associate certain characters with objects and with animals. But with his main characters, they're a little bit of a blank.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's because they're looking out through their, certainly for Pip and David, you're looking out through their eyes, aren't you? So you're never looking at, yeah. Is the story of Conky Chickweed, is it someone who fakes being burgled? Have I remembered that right? And then every day he goes through this kind of elaborate ruse of chasing someone down the street who's stolen something. And it turns out that there was never anyone there and that he'd been doing it himself or something. I love those moments. I love those moments where Dickens seems to disturb himself. So the entrance of Grimwig, isn't it?
Grimwig, yeah.
Who knocks on the door, and it's the most bizarre character, isn't he? That goes on about how he'll eat his head if this happens or doesn't happen. What's he all about? Why is he there? Because who else would put him in? Which other writer would do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, these characters that have almost catchphrases when they come in. And I think that speaks to a few different things in Dickens. And one of them is serial novels, where these characters who are not main characters, they're not going to develop, they're not going to change. They serve a little bit of a plot function. You need people to remember them. And it's 24 installments. It's 2 years that Oliver Twist is published over. So Grimwig, all he needs to do is come in and say, I'll eat my head, and we know who he is and we remember him. But I do think he also illuminates something, thinking about the idea of doubling again, about Mr. Brownlow and the kind of appropriate gentlemanly behaviour. Because he's got the same class position, he's got the same kind of status as Mr. Brownlow. And Dickens is showing us criminal characters, some of whom can be redeemed and some of whom can't. And Grimwig tells Brownlow, Oliver's not coming back. He's going to take your money and he's going to run. And Mr. Brownlow chooses to trust Oliver. And it looks like Grimwig is correct. Oliver doesn't come back, but we know that's not what happens. And obviously he does eventually come back. But Mr. Grimwig then is showing us another kind of middle-class Victorian gentleman who treats the poor as if they're all the same and treats the criminal class as if they are the same and assumes the worst in people. And he's telling us something about Mr. Brownlow as a more generous, perhaps more Christian, in Dickens's view, idea of morality and middle-class morality in particular. And then the other thing is that E.M. Forster criticism of Dickens as having flat and round characters, and him just being one of those flat characters that doesn't really live like a real person. He's just the kind of animated clothes of a person almost. He comes in, he says, I'll eat my head, and that is it. And that kind of idea that Dickens is not really capable, in the view of some early 20th century writers and Victorian writers as well, of fleshing out a character like that. So in some ways, they're some of the most memorable characters in Dickens, ones that come in and say a particular thing repeatedly, and that's all they do. But in another way, they're not quite achieving that kind of high ideal of Victorian realism. But then Dickens isn't trying to do that. So we don't need to judge him by that standard.
No, but I mean, I think Grimwig has a great little journey himself, doesn't he? Because he takes a shine to Rose, doesn't he? And there's that fantastic bit where he inexplicably gets up from his chair, I think, and gives her a kiss on the cheek. And she's completely shocked. Don't be alarmed. I like you. And something, and then he leaves the room, which is just sort of bizarre, isn't it? And there's no real need for it, but that sort of throwaway power that he has and that randomness of throwing things like that in there help the reader refresh, don't they? You know, when you're talking about chapter 17, that opening, if the entire novel was written like that, it would be a very, very wise and heavy read, wouldn't it?
Exactly, yeah. And I think the chickweed thing as well is about that. It's Dickens getting carried away with the fun of these side characters that are not necessarily going to have the kind of wrapped up ending that the main characters will, but we spend a bit of time with them and it's fun. And Dickens is so good at that.
But also, I think Bumble's an interesting character for that, isn't he? Because he's seemingly a bit silly and a bit of light relief, and his ridiculous wooing scene with that ridiculously stupid subtext.
Oh, yes.
But when Bumble and then Mrs. Bumble go into Monks's place, and that whole section with the trapdoor opening up it down into the river, I mean, that's an extraordinary thing. It's like you've got these cartoon characters suddenly in this very, very dark, scary place. With these words, he suddenly wheeled the table aside and, pulling an iron ring in the boarding, threw back a large trapdoor which opened close at Mr. Bumble's feet and caused that gentleman to retire several paces backward with great precipitation. "Look down," said Monks, lowering the lantern into the gulf. "Don't fear me. I could have let you down quietly enough when you were seated over it, if that had been my game." Thus encouraged, the matron drew near to the brink, and even Mr. Bumble himself, impelled by curiosity, ventured to do the same. The turbid water, swollen by the heavy rain, was rushing rapidly on below, and all other sounds were lost in the noise of its plashing and eddying against the green and slimy piles. There had once been a watermill beneath. The tide, foaming and chafing round the few rotten stakes and fragments of machinery that yet remained, seemed to dart onward with a new impulse, when freed from the obstacles which had unavailingly attempted to stem its headlong course. "If you flung a man's body down there, where would it be tomorrow morning?" said Monks, swinging the lantern to and fro in the dark well. 12 miles down the river, and cut to pieces besides," replied Bumble, recoiling at the thought. Yeah, I don't know how you feel about the criticism of Dickens then not being able to flesh out the characters. Do you really think that, or do you feel... Because he puts them in situations that suddenly they don't belong, and that's very powerful, isn't it? He puts them in genres that they don't belong almost, maybe.
Yeah, and this is kind of like writer's advice that people give, isn't it, to people who are writing today, of saying, okay, put your characters in situations that are completely out of their comfort zone and see what they do. It's an interesting question of the Bumbles and that kind of trajectory for them, because obviously it's part of the satire, the beginning satire, to have Mr. Bumble end up as a pauper in his own workhouse. That is the point of showing how things can change and providing, again, that kind of moral justice that the reader wants for these characters. And it doesn't mean that we can never have sympathy for them, and it doesn't mean that we can never laugh with them or laugh at them as well. And Dickens is so good at all of those things.
Yeah, do you feel sorry for Bumble at all? How do you feel towards him?
Not personally, no. I mean, I would say that the novel gives you so many avenues for that, and that's not the one that I would go down. Do you?
No, I don't think I do. Because he's so proud of being a beadle, isn't he? And it reminds me of a sentence from Bleak House where Celesta Dedlock's introduced something like... Celesta was only a baronet, but no baronet was mightier than he, and you could apply that to Bumble being a beadle. He's so inflated, isn't he, and full of self-importance. He represents something provincial, doesn't he, against the great city. So when he has that thing about how, I'm going to go down to London and give evidence, and I'm going to show those people in London how it all works, and then he just completely is blown to pieces. I think that's an interesting tension, isn't it? That Dickens mocks the provincial mindset of some people.
Definitely. And I think also upstarts would be one way of thinking about it. I think of like Uriah Heep and David Copperfield, people that aspire to something that is beyond their station. And with Oliver, it's interesting because Dickens seems to be trying to convey the message that anybody can fall into these horrible situations. But he sort of undermines that because Oliver is of a certain class, speaks in a proper way, doesn't seem to be affected by his circumstances. So him being rehabilitated into the family and the class that he had before, it's kind of a restoration. But characters that actually seek to escape class or to transgress boundaries like that, like Uriah Heep, like Bumble, get punished quite severely for it. And I think that's really interesting in Dickens, this idea of what happens to people who get beyond their station.
That is interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, Dickens himself is very much a climber, isn't he, given his origins? It's interesting that he then has a kind of contempt for a lot of other people that are trying to better themselves, because to be perfectly honest, life is pretty hard, isn't it, if you're kind of low down? So it's understandable that people would want to get on.
Yeah, and I think it does come partly from his family history of, his father always asserting that they had this kind of status. And, he essentially bought a Dickens crest that definitely didn't belong to the Dickens family that they were, and used it for their own. And Dickens ended up using it, this lion crest. So for Dickens, and even in his autobiographical account, the fragment of which we have from John Forster's biography, there's not a sense that this is his class position and he's rising. There's a sense that he is falling from it, and there's a risk of falling from it that needs to be overcome. But there isn't really a sense of climbing. But then Dickens himself, as you say, he very much was like that. And one of the ways that was really evident was the way that he dressed. He dressed like a Regency dandy in pink velvet trousers and, a buttonhole, his beloved geranium. He dressed in quite an old-fashioned, upstart sort of way. He wasn't really au fait with the fashions of the class that he entered into in the mid-century. He was all right in the 1830s. By the time we get to the mid-century, he's a little bit out of step.
Emily, thank you so much. This has been such a brilliant conversation.
Yeah, no, this has been brilliant. And as I said, if you ever want to do the weird short stories, or God forbid his poetry, which I've been working on recently, it's not good, but you definitely get a fun conversation out of it. Then yeah, I'm always pleased to talk about that.
I would love to do that. That would be really fun. I'll get back in touch about that because I don't know any of his poems.
Well, they're not good, but the most fun ones are because he was writing them to Maria Beadnell, his first love. And there's one that satirizes an 18th century poem that's basically imagining everybody in your family as meal items. So it's Maria and all her family as what food they would be. Very long poem on that. So he does like an acrostic for her name as well. So his earliest poetry, it's got those weird 18th century influences again, but he often writes poems in like the autograph albums of ladies in a kind of flirty way. And because I'm trying to compile the most complete version of his poetry that's ever been, and that includes epitaphs and things as well that he wrote for tombs, obviously including Mary Hogarth's as well. So it's interesting. And we're trying to pitch a volume to a publisher on his poetry, but we always have to preface that with, it's not good poetry, but it does tell us interesting stuff about his life and his literary development. Yeah.
Wow, no, that would be really great to talk to you about. Thank
you so much for this. It's been a great conversation, and I love the podcast, and it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Emily.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much, and see you next time.